what are some of the reasons that people don't hear when we try to share the gospel? What are some of the struggles that we have to overcome? Why is it so difficult, and why do people not seem perhaps interested sometimes, and why do they seem not at all interested in something that means a lot to us? And that's, I think, maybe the thing that Christians have a hard time understanding, and that's something I struggle with sometimes. And the gospel means a lot to me. Jesus means a lot to me. Uh, how can it be that something that means so much to me means so little to somebody else, or seemingly means so little to somebody else? What's going on there? Why is there that disconnect? So that's kind of what I want to start with. I'm sorry, does somebody have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, people have different beliefs as to what they believe in. And that's one of the things that they don't want to be interested in, what you have to say about your beliefs. So, and they feel strongly about what they believe in.
Good. Does anybody else have thoughts about that? It was sort of a rhetorical question, but not really. It was also one we could answer. Why do you think? What do you think are some of the obstacles that we have? What have you run up against?
Maybe somebody was born, I mean, not born, but raised, say like you a child and you raised in the church, and that's what you believed, and that's what you learned from your parents, from the church. And some people not raised in the church when they kids and grow up to believe, think maybe, I don't know. Like my husband, he says he believes in something, but he don't know what it is. So I'll say, okay, that's your opinion. I have my opinion. And he believe in different than me. So I don't discriminate or nothing like that. But I have, I guess, a different believer, believe different than him.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. There's a lot of things that go into that. Yeah. Why do we believe the things that we believe? Why do we hold the opinions and the convictions we have? Why do we, take some of the things that maybe we've received and discard them at some point? And why do we hold on to others? And why do we change our beliefs? And there's a whole, you could do a whole lot of study and reading, and people have, over exactly those kinds of questions. Interesting book I read years ago, The Psychology of Belief, it was called. And it's just what it sounds like. It's psychologically, why do people believe what they believe, and how do they come to those convictions? And it was kind of an interesting read. And for us as Christians, part of it is you can't really explain it, because we kind of think that belief is part of the grace of God, right? We come to faith because of God's grace. We come to believe, and we give God the credit for even that. That we have been enabled to believe the gospel when maybe others have not. So there's a lot that goes into it, and I don't mean to try to answer that question, except to say, how do we approach some of these obstacles? How do we approach some of these difficulties? So one of the things that came to my mind, I started thinking about, is what are the biggest problems we have? For Christians, if you want to talk about, like, as a Christian, the biggest problem human beings have, or the biggest 2 or 3 problems human beings have, how would you answer that? What are the biggest problems as a Christian that human beings have?
Well, one of them is, I guess, is sin.
Okay. On any Christian's list, that would come very high. Sin is a big problem. The fact that we are sinners, that we fall short of what God expects of us, and that's a big problem. Well, what's another one that might come up pretty quickly, pretty high on the list?
I think you can put them all under the category of sin, and we have an adversary who works in the world who's leading us to sin.
Okay. We have Satan at work in our world. And so that's a big problem. Responsible for a lot of the evil in our world. Other thoughts, other problems we might put high up on the list.
Well, I don't know exactly how to say it, but it's like just the randomness of events. You know, like down there in Mexico City, this a couple days ago, you know, people are riding on this train across, you know, it's an elevated train, and you know, part of it gives way, and something like 24 people are killed. And there's no, I think there's a thing in the Bible that Jesus talks about, where a tower fell and people were killed, and Jesus said, were those people any more wicked than anybody else? And he said no, but it's just the randomness of how things work, and our helplessness in the face of that. And I think that's a very real, I would call it a fear that people have.
Yeah, I mean, classically, the theologians would call that the problem of evil, right? That there's a loving God, we believe in a loving God, and yet terrible things happen. And how do you grapple with that? How do you deal with that? And how do you come through that with faith intact, and with hope, and with trust in God's goodness and God's faithfulness? And there are lots of explanations for that, lots of ways to work through that. But that's absolutely, that's one of the problems that we deal with, we grapple with. And that's something I think that a lot of people do grapple with in some way or the other. The as you said, the lack of control, the helplessness in the face of certain events. And I think believers and unbelievers alike struggle with that reality. Now, there's a difference in the way they see it, in the way that a believer would think of that randomness versus an unbeliever, but it's something that I think we have in common. And that's one of the things I kind of wanted to get at in this. There are problems that we believe human beings have as Christians, that those who aren't Christians don't see those problems, don't recognize them, don't acknowledge them as problems at all. I'm thinking of some of the things you guys talked about. We're under the power of sin and death, which means our lives wind up as human beings being defined by those two things. Our lives wind up being defined by sin and by death. And as Christians, we believe that God has dealt with that through Jesus. But that's something that we see as a big problem, that a lot of human beings don't see as a big problem, certainly not the sin part of it, death maybe, but not the sin part of it. Human beings don't acknowledge God's standard of right and wrong. That's a problem for us as Christians that others aren't going to really embrace and aren't going to worry about too much. We worship the wrong things. Human beings worship the wrong things. That's a big problem for Christians. We look at that and we go, wow, that's an issue. That's one of the, that's one of the 10 big ones, right? That's one of the top 10 that you don't do as believers. You don't worship other gods. But that's something that's common among human beings, and it's something that most human beings don't really see as a problem and don't think of it in those terms at all. We're separated from God. We see that as a problem. A lot of human beings don't see that as a problem. They don't recognize that as an issue at all. And in fact, some would say, I like the idea of a God that's pretty far removed from us. And some would say, that their conception of God is sort of he winds things up and lets it go and doesn't have much interaction. So that's one of the issues that we deal with in trying to share our faith. For an example, pretend Linda is not a believer, right?
Mhm.
And I go to Linda and I say, Linda, here's your problem. You're in sin. You're caught in sin. And you need God to save you from your sin. Well, I've got an uphill climb right there, right? Because now I've got to convince Linda, first of all, that she's a sinner, and which she could credibly say, I'm no worse than anybody else. I'm no worse than than Darlena. I'm no worse than Alan. I'm no worse than anybody else here. And why do you call that sin? I mean, by whose standards? And so you've right away, you've got this struggle because you're coming at this thing from, as a Christian, what you believe is a very big problem. You're a sinner. But the person you're talking to doesn't see that problem. And so how are they going to hear? How are they going to hear that without coming to that conclusion somehow? So one of the things that we struggle with, what is our problem? What is the problem that needs to be solved? What do you think? Think about people in your life who are not Christians, maybe, or maybe they're just kind of not really religious at all. Maybe they would say they're Christians, but just because that's kind of what they were told they were. But they don't really practice their faith in any way. It doesn't really shape them in any way. So, what are some of the things that you think somebody who is not a Christian, not a believer, not religious, might say is the big problem in the world? What are some of the things that they might say is the big problem that has to be solved?
I think a lot of people would say that hate is
Yes.
a problem that has to be solved.
Yes.
What do you say, Diana?
Hate.
Oh, okay.
For sure. What's
Yeah.
another one somebody might say?
Crime.
Crime. Okay, we live in cities that are filled with crime. And how do we deal with that? How do we figure that out? Now, again, as Christians, we would not say that hate is not a problem, crime is not a problem. We would say those aren't the fundamental problems that need to be solved, right? We recognize those things as problems. They're just not the big problem. They're not the ones, the problem that kind of is responsible for all the others. Somebody might say poverty. Somebody might say, my big problem is I don't have enough money and I need more money.
Some people might say that religion is the problem.
Religion is a problem. Absolutely. That's actually a big shift in our culture. That's, I think, responsible for a lot of the what people are, term as the decline of Christianity. It used to be godless communism was the big enemy, right? It was those godless communists that were the big enemy. Religion was the answer. Now, who are the enemies? Well, it's the fundamentalists, it's the terrorists, it's the ultra right wingers. It's they're the problem. And so religion has become not the solution. Religion has become the problem in the eyes of a lot of people. Absolutely. So you kind of have this, you see where I'm going, right? As Christians, we kind of have a worldview that says, here are the big problems: sin, death, separation from God, worshiping the wrong things. These are the big fundamental issues. And people in our world who are not Christians hear us say that and go, those don't seem so bad to me. Does that make sense? You see where I'm getting? You see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons I think that we struggle to convey our message, to convey the gospel, because other folks aren't seeing the same problems that we're seeing. And the most urgent problem, the one that has the most immediate, drastic effect on your life, is the one that's going to be on your mind most of the time. And you're like that too, let's face it, right? You know, if you get sick, what's your big problem? the big problem in your life. You might say, well, sin is my big problem, death is my big problem. But what you're going to say is, this disease right now is my big problem. That's the one I'm going to be focused on.
Trying to get better, right?
Right. That's what, exactly. That's what I'm going to be kind of consumed with. So that's the way it works. People look at the world, they say, here's the big problem, and that's what's on their mind. You ever heard the old saying? I kind of like it. The old saying that when all you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. you get that, right? You know, if all you've got's a hammer to use, then every problem you run across, you're just gonna whack at it until it either goes away or or you give up. So this is an issue as we try to communicate the truth of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is people see different problems out there, and often people we like to share the gospel with reject it because they don't think that the gospel is answering the question that they're really asking.
Mm-hmm.
Now you could say what? Well, they're asking the wrong question, right? And that may be, but it doesn't really matter. They're still asking that question. That's where they are. Paul, remember, said, I've become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. So how do we get there? Well, maybe we start with their question. So turn to Acts 17. That's kind of where I wanted to look at, what I wanted to look at tonight. If we have time, we'll look at another text as well, but we'll certainly start with Acts 17 tonight. In Acts 17, starting in verse 16, Paul is in Athens waiting for Silas and for Timothy and to meet up with him. He's in this Greek city of Athens, and Athens is, one of the great cities of the world, right? And it's the greatest of the great cities of the ancient Greek Empire, and under the Roman Empire, it's still a great city. And Acts 17:16 says that Paul is waiting for them, and he's greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. The Epicurean school was a school of philosophy that said, live for pleasure. And pleasure means no sadness, no sorrow, no pain, no annoyance, all the things of life that bring you down. The Epicureans wanted you to avoid those things and to escape those things. And the Stoics were sort of the other way. The Stoics said virtue is the issue, and whatever you have to go through to become virtuous is worth it. Neither were particularly religious in the sense that neither thought the gods offered a whole lot of help to that. So some of them asked, what's this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, which is the sort of by the time of Paul, it was sort of the University of Athens. It was sort of the lecture hall of Athens, where people got together and talked about ideas. And that's what Acts tells us in verse 21. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Paul's a good preacher because he never lets an illustration go to waste, right? The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we're God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So this is Paul's, call it a sermon if you want to, his speech to the Athenians, the university professors of Athens, if you will. And so as you look through this, what do the Athenians think is the problem? They have an altar that has their problem, they think, inscribed on it. What is their problem?
How do you know the gods?
How do you know God, right? How do you know God? The culture is full of idols, and so I mean, this is a culture that gives us Zeus and Athena and Minerva and Aphrodite and all the gods of the Greek pantheon that you can think of, right? This is the culture that gives us that. So Paul looks around, he sees idols everywhere he goes, idol temples everywhere he goes. Now, maybe everybody didn't believe in all the gods, maybe some people didn't believe in any of them, but the overarching problem that is summed up in that altar is we don't know. We can't figure out God. We can't figure this thing out. So we worship all these gods, and there's legends about catastrophes coming upon a Greek town here or there, and they make the accustomed sacrifices to all the different gods, and they cover all the gods they can think of and all the gods they can know of, and nothing makes a difference. And so they reason, well, then there's a God we don't know about, and he's mad at us. And so they create this altar to this unknown God, and they lift up their sacrifices to this unknown God, because that's got to be the answer. I mean, that's paganism in a nutshell. That's the way it works. You got to appease the gods. And if you mess up and don't appease the gods correctly, then you're going to have a problem. So this is the struggle that Paul sees in this altar. Now, look at that sermon we just read. How does Paul think the gospel addresses this problem? What does he say about God and about the gospel that he thinks is going to help solve this problem?
I think maybe one thing he might be trying is that God has provided a way for us to know him.
Yeah. God has revealed, God is not far from any one of us, he says, right? Verse 27.
Right.
And in fact, he says all of God's activity among human beings was so that people would reach out for him and find him. So he's kind of implicitly saying the fact that you don't know God means you're doing it wrong, because God wants you to know him. God would like you to know him. God has done all this for you so that you would reach out and find it. He's not far from any of us. And in fact, he quotes even a Greek poet to say that we're his offspring, we're his children. God has given birth to us. So there's this contrast, right? The problem is we can't know God. We can't figure it out. And Paul is saying, but God wants you to know him. God would like for you to know him. And he's left himself with all this evidence, and he wants you to know him. And so don't think that he needs us, right? Don't think that he's anything like these idols that you've made. Don't think that he needs us to care for him. He cares for us. And in the past, God has excused the ignorance of idol worship. That's what Paul says here. In the past, God has said, it's okay. They're trying, they're reaching out, they're feeling around in the darkness, trying to find me. And he's allowed for that. But he says now is the time to repent, because he has set a day when he'll judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And who is that man that he's appointed? Jesus. He's given evidence of this. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So what Paul is saying, what the gospel says, is God wants you to know him. And God has raised someone from the dead who is going to be the basis for which he judges the world with justice. And we hear judge and we think negatively. Paul means that positively. There's going to be justice. There's going to be righteousness. Good is going to be done and evil is going to be excluded. And God is going to do this through Jesus. And through
another thing, Patrick, that he was teaching them was that there's only one God.
Yeah.
That must have knocked their socks off right there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the assumption that Paul goes by, right? This idolatry is doing it wrong because you think you've got to cover all your bases with all these other gods.
Yeah, that was
saying there's just one
radical teaching.
And this is who he is. I mean, it wasn't totally radical because the Jews had been saying that for several thousand years, right? It wasn't a totally radical idea, but it was certainly radical for Greeks.
These people, these were not Jews; these are Gentiles.
Certainly radical for non-Jews in Athens.
But basically, what Paul's doing is he's taking what's common in the culture, which is idols, and using idols to bring the people to the gospel. And then we got to do the same thing. We can figure out how to do that.
He's addressing the problem that they think is the big problem, and he's saying, here's the way God has addressed this. God has reached out to you, and through Jesus, he's asking you to turn your back on all this incorrect worship of idols, and instead embrace him and embrace your status. And that's interesting. Embrace your status as his offspring. Paul's not saying, I've got this secret club that only I can get into and only you can get into if you achieve a certain level, right? We're all his offspring, Paul says. Your own poets have said, we're his offspring. So embrace that, embrace that status as God's offspring. And here's how he's shown it, and it's in the raising of Jesus from the dead. It's a very different way than we often think of the gospel, because we often think in terms of sin and atonement, and Paul doesn't use that, mainly because the Greeks aren't asking that question, and they're not dealing with those things in the same way. Does Paul address sin here? Yeah, he addresses sin, right? He says, repent of your idolatry. He certainly addresses the fact that they're sinners, but they're sinners because they don't have the big question right. So he starts where the big question is, and he works from there to talk to them about the gospel, about what God has done, and about Jesus. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
You kind of see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah.
Now, does it work? Here's the other question to ask about this. Does it work?
Not then and there.
What's that?
Not then and there.
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by work, right? It doesn't work in mass. There's not a huge response. In fact, a lot of them sneered when he heard about resurrection from the dead. It's interesting, earlier when they said he's advocating foreign gods because he's talking about Jesus and the resurrection. The Greek word for resurrection is anastasis, and it's actually also a female name. And so probably what's happening is they're hearing Paul talk about Jesus and anastasis, and they're thinking it's two new gods. And then Paul gets around to talking about Jesus being raised from the dead, and they're like, oh, yeah, right. Yeah, hold on now. We're willing to hear you when you're talking about two new gods, but you're talking about somebody getting raised from the dead. Come on, that doesn't happen.
Mhm.
Now, the fact is, the gospel bumps up against a lot of assumptions that we human beings make. And here's a big problem here, right? These folks aren't embracing the idea of resurrection. We sometimes think of ancient people as much more superstitious and much more gullible, and they just believe anything. That's just not true. Greek people knew, the ancient Greeks knew, when you died, you stayed dead. None of them had ever seen anybody raised from the dead, and it didn't even make it into their stories and legends and myths very much. It just didn't happen. So this is a big cultural gap that Paul's got to fill when we're talking about the resurrection. But the question isn't always, does it work? And if Paul had more time, he probably would have gotten through some of those objections and been able to deal with some of those objections. As it is, some believed, right? Verse 34, some became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus. So one of these guys that Paul's talking with is convinced and believes. So does Damaris and a number of others. So it's not that nobody believes, it's that it's still a hard leap for them to make. But this is how Paul does it, and this is how he does it time and time again. He goes into a town, he goes to the synagogue, right? And in the synagogue, he reasons from the Jewish scriptures. He talks about how the Jewish scriptures say and show that Jesus is the Messiah. But to pull out his Old Testament in the Areopagus and to start talking about the Messiah would mean nothing. That's not the question these people are asking. The question these people are asking is, how do we know about God? And so Paul says, here's how. Here's what the gospel says about that. And it's not it's not this sleight of hand trick where now you can convince anybody if you just know the big question they're asking, because the gospel is sometimes going to challenge their question and say this is the wrong question. But this is maybe where we begin as believers, trying to share the good news of Jesus with those around us. What do they want to know? What are they asking? What's the big problem on their minds? What's the big issue that they're trying to struggle through? And then we got to think about, how does the gospel, how does the truth of Jesus address that question? How does it answer that big problem?
Well, wouldn't you think, excuse me, wouldn't you think that the people would have to open their heart to what he's saying?
Sure. I mean, you still got to believe, right? There still has to be an acceptance. Just because Paul is addressing their question doesn't mean they believe his answer. And there's still going to be a lot of people who don't listen and don't want to hear.
Because the gospel has a life-changing effect.
Sure.
When you read the gospel and try studying, every
Absolutely.
day. And
Absolutely.
it changes a lot about you. Because I believe that's how I was raised as a Catholic, and my parents were. And one side, how you have to go to church. It's no, like, you're not going. And so when I reached 18, you know, I no longer wanted to go because I didn't like the fact of the statutes. I didn't like the fact that when bishops and cardinals and things like that would come, and I have to kneel down and kiss their ring and stuff like that. So that's what changed my mind about. I just didn't believe in that philosophy anymore.
And most people get to points in their lives where they have to ask, do the things they believe address the big questions and address the big problems? And that's how beliefs change. You get to a point where you go, you know what I believe here doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And I got to find something else. You know, I got to ask, I got to look, I got to open myself to some questions. And sometimes they're big questions and sometimes it's smaller things, but you have to adjust that belief system to work and to address the things that you happen to be dealing with. And so what we're hoping as believers, right, is that some of the people to whom we're talking hear in the gospel the answers to some of the questions that they're asking.
Mm-hmm.
We don't always know what those are going to be. And that's the reason you got to get to know people a little bit. And the reason, and some of it's just going to be the grace of God, right? You're just going to accidentally say the right thing, or they're going to accidentally hear the right thing. And that's going to help, you know.
Well, actually, I think it's God that opens our heart.
Yeah, certainly. That's a huge part of it, right? I mean, I think we all would believe that if we share the gospel, it's just we're just planting the seed. We're just putting it out there, and we're hoping and praying that God will do something with that. That they'll be open to what He's doing.
Yeah.
Got about 8:20. Let me just back up into Acts 16 just a minute and just show you this one more time, just to sort of maybe tie it down a little bit. Acts 16. This is when Paul is in Philippi, and he makes the mistake of driving a spirit out of a girl who had been used by some unscrupulous guys to make money fortune telling. And he drives this demon out, this evil spirit out, and the owners of this female slave realized that the cash was about to dry up, and so they accuse Paul and Silas of throwing the city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. Rome had religions that were allowed, and they were, you know, legal religions, and then there were illegal religions. And what they're saying is that Paul and Silas are advocating illegal religions. They're flogged, they're beaten, they're thrown in jail. And probably, you know, the story starting in verse 25. There's an earthquake, the prison doors fly open, everybody's chains fall off. The jailer wakes up and sees what's happened, and he's about to kill himself. Why that response? Why would he kill himself?
When the higher authorities saw that the prisoners probably had escaped, they would have punished the guard by killing him.
Yeah, I mean, or worse. and it, you know, and it would probably have been, you know, probably an honor thing as well, you know, that he's failed in his one job. You had one job, keep these guys in their prison cells, and you can't do that. Paul says, don't harm yourself. We're here. The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. What does he say in Acts 16:30?
What must I do to be saved?
Surely you've heard that sermon before. What must I do to be saved, right? There's the question, right? What's he asking? He's asking, and listen, he's not asking, what must I do so that my sins can be washed away? And that what he's asking is, I've seen something I can't explain. I'm doomed. What do I do to survive? What do I do to get through this? What do I do that I come out alive on the other side of this? He knows something has happened that is beyond him, right? It's beyond explanation. And so he goes to them and says, what do I do to be saved? Help, save me. And Paul says, believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, you and your household. And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. And the jailer took them and washed their wounds, and immediately he and all his household were baptized. He's asking the question, and Paul says, here's the answer. Here's the response. Believe in Jesus and you'll be saved. And Paul and Silas suddenly have a lot of credibility in his eyes, and he believes. And he becomes a follower of Jesus.
Yeah. But
Again.
he needed hope. And the jailer needed hope. He had no hope at that point. So he saw Paul had hope, in his message. And that's a dream question, right? For all of us. We all wish somebody would come to us and say, what must I do to be saved? Doesn't happen very often, but we would all love to see that, I think.
I mean, I think sometimes it is happening and we just don't necessarily hear it because it's not always in those words.
Yeah, we don't hear it, right?
I think a lot of times people are asking that question when they're asking other questions. What they're asking is that big one, though. Whatever I think is wrong, whatever I think is the big problem, how can I be saved? Help. And as believers, we need to know the truth of the gospel enough that we can begin to respond to that. And sometimes it's just by telling our story. Sometimes it's just by saying, here's what I believe. Here's how I'm making it. Here's how I'm getting through this coronavirus. I mean, that's a big question people have had for the last year in our world, right? How do we survive this? How do we get through this? Well, as Christians, we've got an answer to that. We can respond to that question. How do we deal with racial injustice in our world? That's a big question people are asking. We can respond to that. We have a response to that. These questions people are dealing with that they need salvation from, we have a response. As Christians, we have an answer that we can offer. Peter says, always be ready to give an account, to give a defense of the hope that you have. And we have that, and we can share that in Jesus.
I kind of wish it was a Bible movie. That
Well,
way you can see things more clearly,
There are some, yeah, there are some. Not always in the whole Bible, and some of the things we'd like to know about. Yeah. Comments, questions? We need to wind it up, I guess.
Well, I got kind of a question. What if Paul came to Chicago today? Do you think he would preach the same sermon? I think he would preach a similar sermon, not exactly the same because the times have changed, but we got a lot of idol worship in our city and other cities too, not just Chicago. But all of them.
I think he would preach Jesus in a way that we might give a hearing to, in a way that might connect with where we are and what we're asking and what our big questions are.
I think it's the angle Paul would use. He would use that angle of idol worship somewhere. He'd work it in somewhere.
I mean, it's one of the big issues, right? Our disordered worship. We're worshiping the wrong things. All right. Thank you guys very much. Good to see you all. Have a great night and good day tomorrow.
Good lesson.
Good night, everyone.
Your thoughts.
Good night, everybody.
Bye. Good night,
Good night.
everyone. Enjoy your
Good night,
birthday,
Darlene.
Miss
Good
May.
night. Good night,
Feel good,
everyone.
Dorothy, and
Night, Richard.
everyone.
Good night.
See you later. See you,
Good
Pam.
night.
Good night.
Night, Jane.
Good night, Jane.
Night, Darlene. Night, Linda.
Good night, Patrick, Laura, John, Josh.
Bye, Laura, John, and Josh.
Good night, Darlena.
Good
Take care.
night, baby.